About 3 hours.
Okay, perfect.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is IDAGIO Live. It is Tuesday, so it must be Tuesdays with Thomas and our new initiative called Song and Beyond, a partnership with the Hampson Foundation and IDAGIO Live, where classical music happens. Welcome to our show tonight. It is, in fact, election night in America, and I'm sure that most of the world feels like it's election night for them too, because God knows we've heard nothing but this election for I don't know how long. But as our great president, what was it, the 14th president, declared our government of the people, by the people, for the people, we shall see how the people speak tonight, and it'll be very exciting. So that's all I'm going to say about politics. Probably, maybe. My guests may have other things to say. Tonight, we're going to have an interesting program. We are still very much in song and beyond, but we're a little bit more in the beyond category than song general. We're going to talk about, among other things, the famous Star-Spangled Banner of America. You know, oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light? That tune. And this man, Dr. Mark Clague, who is sitting in front of you, is the world's specialist in the history of and the context of, and is in fact writing a very important scholarly book, which we're going to have him explain to us what he's found in his travels, that will come out hopefully sooner than later. And of course will be published in 120 different languages, because everybody wants to know everything about the Star-Spangled Banner. But Mark, you are, first of all, you're a friend. 2, you're a colleague. 3, you're one of the most wide-ranging musicologists in terms of interest and expertise that I know. And I think everybody would love to. I don't even know some of this thing. I mean, where do you come from? I mean, give us the 2.5-minute Wikipedia Dr. Mark Clague of University of Michigan story.
Well, Thomas, thanks so much for having me here on this day. It's a scary day for me, a nervous day. I had a little too much caffeine this morning, so hopefully I won't be bouncing around. But it's an exciting day, and I think I've become obsessed with the national anthem of the United States of America, the Star-Spangled Banner, which was written in 1814. With lyrics by Francis Scott Key, and then a melody that traces its history back to England around the time of the Revolution, actually, but by a court composer, a sacred music composer named John Stafford Smith, who actually worked for King George III. Oh, yeah. So it's sort of ironic that a King George III related melody becomes the anthem, not only of the United States, but actually other countries use the same melody as well. So it's, but I got into it largely through my work as a teacher. I actually grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, here where the University of Michigan is located. So I was a kid here. I grew up in the late 1960s. I was a little infant, but the American Bicentennial of 1976 was, I think, formative for me, as was my father, who every year we took a summer driving vacation for 2 weeks, and we got in the car, and he went to a medical conference.
It sounds like a National Lampoon film.
It does. And in some ways, I wish I had the...
I had the same thing. Fantastic.
I had the same thing. And so we went to every darn battlefield of Civil War, Revolutionary War, Appomattox Courthouse, and, all of them. And so it's... and of course, at the time, I was pulling my hair out as a 10-year-old kid, thinking, why do we have to go see yet another mound or a tree that has supposedly a musket ball buried into it?
Was your dad a professor?
He was a neurologist, so he was a physician.
But history buff.
A history buff, absolutely. I loved American history. And so he got the last laugh for sure. He passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago, but by becoming a historian of music and specializing in American music, I think he won the influence battle for sure.
That's fantastic. So and you went to school in Ann Arbor then?
I did. I did my undergrad here. It's an amazing place, and literally, the school is different from the town in many ways. I mean, you can grow up in one and not spend much time in the other. So for me, it felt like going away to school to a certain extent. But it's an amazing place, and I've one of the weird professors who actually not only went to school here but grew up here and then came back to be a professional historian here. So it's really a dream come true for me.
So you have, okay, we've been through, so the academic marches through, bachelor's and master's and then doctorate.
Mhm.
Your doctorate is in musicology, right?
Doctorate is in musicology, yeah, from the
And what was
University of
your
Chicago.
what was your sword in the ground, as it were?
In terms of my
What?
dissertation, you mean?
Yeah, dissertation or what? I mean, when did you start really specializing in American music? I think it was you that told me that actually it wasn't until quite recently, 15 or 20 years ago, that you could actually prosecute yourself, if that's the right word, as a doctorate student and specialize in American music. Is that not true?
It's really shifted. I would say it's the earliest inklings of that were in the 1970s. That's when people started
Wow.
to look at popular culture. I mean, it started with jazz, but then got into rock and roll and popular music as being worthy of sort of research study. For
Right.
all of the professors who did that work in the 1970s had cut their teeth in European classical music. So, someone like Eileen Southern, who was a real pioneer of African American music, did
Right.
Renaissance music, and my mentor, Richard Crawford, who's still here in Ann Arbor, emeritus professor, was actually one of the very first people to study an American music topic. But he studied sort of early American psalmody, so did a religious
Hmm.
music that was, sort of counted in the politics of academia of the time. And,
Hmm.
when I first started my career as a student in the 1990s, if you went to the national and international musicology conferences, American topics and popular music were almost non-existent. Lots of discussion of Schubert and his sexual orientation. That was the big controversy when I was my first year in grad school. But it was really, that's completely changed. And now
It's very
American
funny
topics
because
are
I
half
mean,
of it.
for you and I and our friendship, and we'll get to that. But apropos of that, my whole relationship to the Society of American Musicologists or American Musicological Society,
Hmm.
both of them from which I have scholarships in the name of the foundation, I think even in my name.
Yes, you
The
do.
only reason I got involved with these organizations because of American music and
Wow.
because of American musicology. I knew Wiley Hitchcock.
Hmm.
I wanted to say quite well, but that's not true. We met 2 or 3 times. I admired him enormously as a scholar, and he was extremely generous. He was one of the first people I talked to him about my idea of what Song of America, or at that time Song in America. In fact, I think the project at that time was still called "I Hear America Singing," quoting Walt Whitman.
Hmm.
But I mean, did you know Wiley? And two questions: did you know Wiley? But then a previous question about your family: did you grow up playing an instrument? Was your family musical? Was music a big deal at home?
So my dad played the saxophone and played in a jazz band early on, but he, did that in high school, and I don't think really afterwards. I
I just lost
played.
sound.
Oops, I was saying my dad.
Is that me or you?
It might be you. I can hear you. I don't know if I'm still live or not.
Well, tell everybody your story. I'll figure it out.
Hopefully it's going through. But my my father definitely influenced my work and as a musician. But I started on the saxophone, played in jazz bands, and then I switched to the bassoon. And the cool thing about the bassoon was that nobody else played the bassoon, and so I got lots of amazing opportunities to play in high school with youth ensembles and both in band and orchestra. And that's
And it's
really what.
light, and it's lighter than the saxophone, right?
Um, it's probably a little bit heavier. I played the
Really?
small saxophone. I played alto. If
All
you
right,
played the
E
barrier,
flat, or
yeah,
something. Right.
exactly. So I played the small saxophones, but that was definitely hugely formative for me. And he, really supported my musical career, and
Right.
I had my own instruments and lessons and all that stuff. And it was really my whole social life. I mean, I think part of my interest in music comes out of that experience. What's relevant here for me is that, like all my friends were musicians. I spoke to people about music. My social relationships were about music. And so when I went to music history classes early on, and they talked about music as being transcendent, right? That we loved Beethoven because now 250, 300, whatever years later, we still love Beethoven, means it could break free of its political,
Mm. Mm.
eccentricities of its moment in time. For me, that didn't really resonate because what made music interesting was the fact that it was part of my life and it was part of my relationships
Mhm.
with other people and the way it brought communities together. So I've been interested in sort of the politics of music and the sociology of music from the very
Mhm.
beginning. And that's really what sort of led to my work in American music, because as I wanted to do a sociology of music project, and that's a thing in Germany. Like there's music sociology in
Mm.
Germany. And that's a discipline. It's not really a discipline in the United States. We have ethnomusicology, which is sort of music in its social context, and musicology, which supposedly is looking at the musical object. They've really blended together in certain ways, but the notion of music sociology is within the discipline, but not really foregrounded. And so I wanted to study American culture because I could get all of the details. Really what I wanted were financial records. So I had a really, one of my sort of most influential classes in college was a class with called Great Books, sort of a pretty typical, literature class. You're studying the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I remember—
Was that based on the Adler work at the University of Chicago?
No, well, it was a particular professor named Cameron who like everybody loved, and he I think passed away just a few years ago. I used to see him still walking around campus, and but with an amazing lecturer and just knew everything inside and out, up and backwards. And but I remember one student asked at one point, it said like, the Romans and the Greeks, they didn't really believe in these gods, right? They didn't believe in Zeus and Athena and Mercury. Like these are just stories for them, just like for me. And he gave a very short and for me very profound answer, which is he said, it costs a lot of money to build a temple. And so when looking at the history of music, one of the interesting things to look at is like, what do people spend money on? Because when we talk about what we value, we value that with an exchange called money. And so someone like, Berry Gordy at Motown, like one of his big things was like, okay, you have $1. Are you going to buy a sandwich or this record? And if the answer is a sandwich, then the record's got to go back and get remixed because it's got to be better. Until the record is more valuable than the sandwich. If you're going to put money on that rather than food, that's when it's ready for release. So you can see
along those lines, I was reading an article that the other day that it is curious in all of this incredible economic meltdown. Actually, telephones are doing real well. Not just iPhones, just across the board, it's, what have you got to have, so I guess everybody is somehow not starving to death, and ergo the next thing is a telephone. But another slightly more disturbing thing is that since March 15 to date, Americans have spent $17 million. No, they have bought 17 million weapons.
Wow. Yeah, I was thinking earlier today that that's one of the differences from, in some ways the partisanship we're experiencing now. I mean, as I write this book about the anthem, I see this kind of partisan warfare in the song lyrics.
Right.
We'll get into it, I'm sure, but one of the sort of profound or reorientations of my thinking about the Star-Spangled Banner is that it's just one lyric of many that is sung to that melody in the history of the United States. And I have really, for the last decade or more, been working at collecting different alternate lyrics. And they used to be basically newspaper ballads. They were published as, lyrics of poetry within newspapers. And then it would say at the top tune, Rosin the Bow, or Rise Columbia, or Hail Columbia, or a whole host of sort of basic, political, sort of patriotic melodies. And
everybody would assumingly know.
Yeah, everybody knew these. It was just,
Right.
I think of it like take me out to the ball game or happy birthday. We're not singing, I think, as much as we're listening to music because it can be mechanically reproduced, right?
Right.
Whereas in the 19th and 18th century, if you had music, you had to make it yourself, basically.
Right.
You had to have someone making it. So people were much more prone to singing in church and other places. But this idea of, it was expensive to re-engrave music or to have instruments. It was cheap to have a voice, and it was cheap to have a set of words that you could print in a newspaper and then pass those around. And so I have at this point found 450 different sets of words that were sung to the tune that Americans know as the Star-Spangled Banner.
450.
I know. I used to think
I spent last season talking about the over 240.
Yeah, I know. I literally have found 150 in the last like 3 or 4 weeks. Because these.
Okay, hold that thought. We don't. I'm going to keep that. We want to hold it. I want to go back and pick up still who you are. And you're in Michigan. You've got your doctorate. You've decided that music in America, but especially as the social tapestry, and obviously, ladies and gentlemen, you can tell that Mark and I became instant colleagues and friends, because if you've got a byline to a radio series that says the history of culture seen through the eyes of poets and ears of composers, Mark Clague is going to be a first address to call up and say, can you help me with this? And we're going to talk about it. But that's another story. But you are teaching at the academy, you're teaching at the university. You've got several different programs that you've been heading up or in charge of. I mean, obviously your academic title and in the dean of the administration is all interesting and so forth. But what are these? And then somehow in there, get us to the Gershwin situation.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I started here really as an editor on a music editing project that Richard Crawford, my mentor, had started. And Rich was actually—
Didn't Richard Crawford write a very important book about American history, music of history?
A bunch of it, yeah. So America's Musical Life, A History.
Exactly. That's what I'm thinking.
His very large tome. He has a book about Gershwin, came out recently. But Wiley Hitchcock was actually a professor at the University of Michigan and was Richard Crawford's teacher. And then Wiley went to, to CUNY, I think to Brooklyn College, right? Yeah. And then Rich stayed here, and then I studied with Rich. So that's my lineage is sort of—
I love it.
Great grandson, I guess, of Wiley Hitchcock. And but I knew Wiley because when I was— my very first job at the University of Michigan was actually in an editing project called Music of the United States of America. And it had really come off the bicentennial, and like 20 years later, it was basically to publish the musical monuments of the United States. And, Germany has a very long tradition of critical editing, and England does. And if you go to the library, you see these huge shelves full of the masterpieces of the culture. And the United States wanted to do the same thing. And I worked on that project with Rich. But then when he retired, I actually was one of the people hired to replace him. And the University of Michigan has a long tradition in studying American music. It goes back to Alan P. Britton and different people working in hymnody even before Wiley. But it's that teaching that's really driven my own research in the Star-Spangled Banner, because I now teach Rich Crawford's class in American music. And the first thing you ask is, well, what is American music? So the way I answer that for my students is we start off watching Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock play the Star-Spangled Banner. And so I don't know what American music is, but that's definitely it. And let's unpack that. Let's try to figure out what is he doing by singing the song on the strings of an electric guitar. And I try to complicate the story by saying, here's a guy playing on an instrument you're not supposed to be playing the Star-Spangled Banner on. And if you say the words along with his performance, if you find it on YouTube, it's when he gets to the rockets red glare and the bombs bursting in air that all goes crazy. So it's really like Renaissance word painting. I mean, it's really pictorialisms where the bombs are bursting, and and there's rioting, and it's all very much tied to the 1960s, to Martin Luther King's assassination, to the Vietnam War, and he had friends in the Vietnam War because he was a paratrooper. So it's that fascinates me, again, the way that speaks, and I think it's both very personal. So it was about Hendrix figuring out who he was as an American, because he had, grown up here. He had his own struggles. He went to England, I think, sort of looked back at the Americans, got a new perspective, and then he comes back and he literally is playing the anthem from that point on. But it's also about the country, like, where is the country going? And so my students asked me, well, where's this song from? And what did it used to sound like? And who wrote it? And when and why? And those answers, to answer those questions, I went back to 1814 and Francis Scott Key and actually, just sort of fell into the rabbit hole of this whole story.
Okay, we're going to go to that story, but before we do that, because I mean, people watching, you can see behind you, you've got the George Gershwin book, you've got Blackness and Opera, you got the Star-Spangled Banner songbook, which I'm very proud to be anywhere near that and associated to the project. In terms of, first of all, the Gershwin project, that was a pretty big deal for the University of Michigan to land that critical edition project, wasn't it? And and you're the editor of it. And I have enormous cachet to be on your advisory board and do absolutely nothing to date. But how did that come about? Are those kinds of projects usual in University of Michigan or universities in general? Well,
I mean, they're definitely, these big research projects is something that an institution can undertake. I mean, a critical edition, it's not something that a commercial publisher can really do. It's just too expensive to do the work.
Right.
And you don't create new copyrights and all that. So it's, we actually just sort of were in the right place at the right time and had the expertise. So I mentioned that project, Music of the United States of America, since I'd cut my teeth as a scholar professionally editing music, which is a real old school kind of
Yeah,
task, right?
exactly.
And
Yeah.
not something that when I was in grad school, we really got trained in. It used to be like core. You learned how to interpret, old notation from the Renaissance and medieval times. And that's sort of gone by the wayside in musicological training, because it used to be that just finding the music to study was one of the big tasks that scholars had to do. But at this point, most of the music, or a lot of it anyway, is out there. We know Beethoven's works, we know Mozart's works, we know a lot of the works, and there's still stuff to be discovered, but that process is happening all the time. But so when the Gershwin family called us and actually said, we're interested in having someone take on this work, are you interested? We were able to say, yeah, absolutely, this is important because we know American music, but also we know critical editing. And so it took a long time to work with the Gershwins to earn their trust, to let them know that we were going to do it. But because of the fact that we are a high, standard performing institution, with an opera program and a musical theater program and a jazz program, orchestral band, as well as, a great musicology program, we feel we can sort of do the two things together. And one of the things that's special about this project that I'm really proud of is that we have all our students do test drive all of the musical scores we produce. So we've done American in Paris and Concerto in F. We've done Rhapsody in Blue. Porgy and Bess was the last opera I actually saw at the Met. I don't know when we're going to see another one, but it's
And they were using your work, your critical.
They were. Well, it was a scholar named Wayne Shirley who worked for many, many years at the Library of Congress. I'm sure you ran into them. Encyclopedic mind and an incredibly skilled editor.
I was going to say, how closely do you work to the Library of Congress? I mean, there's the whole Gershwin archive down at the Library of Congress, right? Where a lot of the manuscripts are. In fact, they have a Gershwin Prize for contemporary musicians.
Exactly, for songwriting. We work very closely with the Library of Congress. They are the repository for all of the Gershwin original materials. And what we have, because of our relationship with the family, is the ability to take high resolution photographs of all of those materials. So we actually work from scans and photographs. We don't work from the original material, because that's the Gershwin stuff is the stuff that's, down there with Francis Scott Key's manuscript and, all of these, incredible documents of American history that are stories and stories and stories below ground in these fireproof vaults.
Have you been there in those places?
I have been down there once. Yeah, it was pretty awesome.
I mean, it's just breathtaking, isn't it? I was down there once as well. Yeah. It was just, you're like, it's like Disneyland when you're 6 years old. It's unbelievable. It's
very cool. Yeah, so that's really exciting. But it's been an amazing project, and I didn't really expect to make a lot of discoveries like the new pitches of the taxi horns or the original pitches of the taxi horns. But what's interesting with history is that the details are always more fascinating than the expectation.
Well, I was extremely proud to make Kirill Petrenko in Munich, and then now to the Berlin Philharmonic, aware of the critical edition of the American in Paris, because he wanted to play the piece, and he knew the piece, but he didn't really know the piece. And he was very interesting about this critical edition and the missing moments and the edits and the horn sounds and the things. And that's the kind of musician he was. So I dined out on that relationship pretty mercilessly.
See, you have done something important as a member.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But it was thrilling. It was thrilling to hear. So how far along are you in the work? As I remember, you said we're about to start the songs, right?
We are starting to work on the musical theater shows. We're working on a show called Primrose right now. That's the first one. It's not a very well-known one. It's one of the earliest ones that George and Ira worked on together. It premiered in London, in the West End, rather than in the United States. Sort of a silly period story in a way, very much a boy meets girl or girls. So it's one of the earliest ones for which we have George's orchestration that survived. So that's one of as he got more and more famous, you didn't use the time of the creator to do the orchestrations. So the later stuff of the Egg Sing, Let 'Em Eat Cake used a lot of professional orchestrators. So we just wanted to start with something to get cut our teeth really on the musical theater stuff, because it's its own genre. There's different notation, and in terms of abbreviations that you have to realize, and you have to deal with the fact that in an orchestra piece you assign the flute and the clarinet and the bassoon and the saxophone different lines. In musical theater, it's read 1, read 2, read 3, and they pick up whatever instrument they're supposed to be playing. So it's a lot different to work on a practical level. And And we really want, and I think the most exciting thing for me about the Gershwin edition is that our research comes to life in the concert hall. And the fact that Berlin plays my audition is amazing to me, you know, because usually I write a book and an article, and every once in a while I hear that someone read it. But it's amazing.
I think we should design a weekend when the songs are done, and I imagine I'll have a little bit more to do with that. But we should just do a weekend and we just sing all of George's songs.
That would be a great weekend.
Wouldn't that be fabulous? All right, we're going to move over that.
Go ahead. I was just going to say it has been recorded by Louis Langray and the Cincinnati Symphony, as well as the National Orchestral Institute. So people want to look at those on the Adagio Library. I'm sure they're there.
We might even try. We might, if we get into screen sharing. I just want to give an idea of the breadth and the scope of the stuff you're working on. I see this Blackness in Opera, which is written by one of our colleagues at University of Michigan.
Naomi?
I get to say our because I don't know what my title is, but I'm now hooked at the hip with you all over there,
exactly.
as a visiting professor of something.
I think you're a distinguished guest artist.
I'm a distinguished guest artist, right? Thank you very much. And I'm not playing that down. I'm not being coy, ladies and gentlemen. It's because of a very extensive, and full disclosure, the Hampson Foundation is in a very significant partnership, a very excited partnership with the University of Michigan about the Classic Song Initiative is what it's called. And our first project is a title you came up with called Art of Democracy. And I'm just going to give an overview. You and I came together because of Susan Keyes, and I knew Susan Keyes because of Michael Tilson Thomas's wonderful project, Keeping Score, which we've done a couple of shows on this as well, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to go back and look at them. Wonderful conversation with Michael about that. But it was in 2014, and I was in Chicago doing something at the opera, and you came down to talk about, because you wanted to do a concert for 2014, would be the 200th anniversary of the Star-Spangled Banner being, as a poem, being written by Francis Scott Key. And quite to my, if I remember correctly, we just kind of talked, and I had to go to rehearsal, and I think you waited and we talked some more, and you brought a fantastic folder full of music and binder full of music.
This book. Yeah.
Exactly, and the famous book and a bunch of CDs and all this stuff. Sort of like, well, have a listen to this, see if you can help out. But it was a pretty contagious story. So go for it. Let's let's just maybe better focus. So we did the project. I came down. There's an adorable picture of the two of us. Thank you for sending that out, of us singing the Star-Spangled Banner at the Sprague Coolidge.
It's the height of my vocal career. That's when I peaked right there.
Well, it was certainly the best bow tie evening we have had. And it was a wonderful concert, more versions of the Star-Spangled Banner. Some of them I met for the first time there, and had such an overwhelming emotional response to the text.
Well, if you remember, Ruth Bader Ginsburg came to the dress rehearsal.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg came to the dress rehearsal, and she was excited. She loved it. And she was such a good friend. She was an amazing woman. Never mind, God rest her. But we did this show, and I remember I because I was, the famous singer, there were a couple of interviews. One was, I think, Al Jazeera, and the other one was another interview with CNN. And what they wanted to, and what the big thing is, where I'm going with this, is that they really wanted to bang, especially CNN, they wanted to bang on the idea, quote unquote, so you're telling me that the Star-Spangled Banner, our great reverence national anthem, is actually born of a drinking tune. And I tried to say, well, actually, societies, humanistic societies and lecture societies and reading where music, these things, yes, there was certainly alcohol involved, and Lord knows how much they drank, but it wasn't the purpose to get together to drink. The purpose was to get together with libation and intellectual exchange. And yes, that's where this came from. Is that right? Or is it truly just a drinking tune?
It's, I struggle with this too, because there was definitely drinking involved. I mean, in 18th century London, if you wanted to drink something, you either needed to boil it first or ferment it. It was the only way it was safe, right? You couldn't just reach down and get your cup out of the Thames. So, there was definitely drinking. It's sort of part of this whole sort of social shift from culture in the court, with the king, to being a middle class, merchant class, legal class world. And they had all of these different societies and clubs, and they were all men's clubs. because women were, sexism prevented them from being in these kind of leadership and economic positions. But there were clubs for everything. And the Anacreontic Society was a club around music, and they hosted Haydn, went to London symphonies and all that. So this is a really high-class club.
It's a lovely, but you just said anachronotic.
Anacreontic.
Anacreontic. Okay.
Anacreontic.
Explain to us what that is. Who's Anacreon, and why is that club called that?
So Anacreon was a Greek lyric poet, one of like the big five of Greek poetry, and was known for sort of frivolity, but also for having a kind of focus on living life and taking pleasure and embracing the natural world, and also women and wine. So
a little bit of Epicurean in there somewhere.
A little bit of Epicurean, a lot of classical culture, because of course the other thing that's happening at this time is that archaeologists are digging up all of classical sites like Pompeii and places, and they're bringing stuff back to the British Museum. So it's hip to be Greek at this moment, right? So part of why you name the popular music club after Anacreon, there's two reasons. One is that it's cool to be Greek at this moment. And it's something that people want to be part of. And there's so many of these clubs, you're trying to attract people to your club. I think the other reason is that there was a little, lyric piece by Thomas Arne called The School of Anacreon. It was done in the 1750s, it's just two arias back to back. But it talks about basically this love of music and the ability to separate from the cares of the day and just bring yourself to thinking and considering other higher thoughts. So it's a kind of Greek literary club that sang to a harpsichord, and they started their meetings with a 2-hour symphony concert, right? So they had a full orchestra, and sometimes Haydn came to visit, and Pleyel and Clemente and all these people. So it's not going to the pub. In that sense, it's not a drinking song, but it is about male sociality. It's about bringing guys together to have a good time. And they sang their club song basically at the beginning of the last portion of their meeting, which was a period of singing. And any women who were guests for the symphony concert would go home. They had dinner, and then they would basically sing grace. They would sing a religious hymn. And then they would sing To Anacreon in Heaven, which was their club song, was To Anacreon in Heaven, where he's at in full glee. And that's
the whole point. That's where this song started. The actual minuscule atom particle of this thing started as a tribute to Anacreon. That's where the tune came. So if we've got that started, and then we've got Francis Scott Key writing in 1814. At the Battle of Fort McHenry, this poem. And if I'm understanding, so first of all, take us through those other years, how this poem, how this tune got used. But didn't you say to me once that, or publicly or whatever, but that very likely Scott had the tune and the rhythm of the tune in his head when he wrote the poem, or is that nonsense?
Yep. So one of the talking points is it's a club song, not a pub song. And that's actually your quote that you said, I think, on the stage of Coolidge Auditorium in 2014. So, but the other thing is it's a song and not a poem, which is to say that Francis Scott Key imagined those words to the melody from the very beginning. It was never a poem that someone else said, hey, you could sing this to this silly English melody. It was very much constructed. And one of the things that my book does really for the first time is to trace exactly how the music got there. And that melody comes to the United States via Charleston and Philadelphia in 1793 with a group of actors who were with the Old American Company. So they basically, in the Anacreontic Society, this tune was hard to sing. Right. And they were a musicians club, and they wanted to show off why their musicians club was better than any other musicians club. So they wrote a song that required real talent and real skill to pull off. So a lot of the members of the Anacreontic Society were basically Broadway singers, were sort of professional actors and singers. They weren't average. There were average people probably, but they were all people who loved to sing. But they included professionals. And professionals, of course, at this time also tried to curry favor with all of the new wealth that was coming in through the merchants, because they wanted patrons, right? So
Right.
there was a
Right.
there was a method to their madness for participating. So they joined the same club, and they were welcomed because they had this musical skill. So they were the ones who would sing this song. So they would sing the high notes, and the membership as a whole would just echo back the chorus. So the part that with the Star-Spangled Banner is at the end, right? Oh, say does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave, land of free and home of brave. That was sung by everybody, and everything else, including the rockets, red glare, bombs bursting in air, the high notes, was only sung by one person. So this would have been,
All right.
that was different in Key's day and before than here. So it was brought over as part of this acting troupe. The actors probably had sung it for the Anacreontic Society or other similar groups. And they did it as a kind of spoof theater show called the Catch Club or the Sons of Liberty, or they had different names that they would use, but they were basically mocking British bourgeois culture for Americans who wanted to laugh at the
I love it.
pretentiousness. And so they hammed up all the drinking parts of it, right? So they sort of walked around being inebriated. So that's how it gets the reputation of being a drinking song, I think, as much as how it was actually used in the original
Right.
plays. So these
But then it's been,
actors,
go ahead. Go ahead, but it spent then several years even showing up in other political ramifications before it became the Star-Spangled Banner, right?
right. So in the very first one, this acting company tours around. They go to New York. They perform it in 1790. I think it's 1793 still, and they the very first parody lyric about an American political situation happens a month later. And it's about the French Revolution, which was a controversy in the United States at the time, because France, of course, had supported the American Revolution and Lafayette had come over. But the United States economically was trading with both Britain and France. And so when Britain and France, who were the big powers in Europe at that time, were constantly at war with each other, and the United States tried to be neutral. And so they didn't want to take sides, and people in the country, basically the Jeffersonian Democrats supported the French, and the John Adams and the Federalists supported the British. And those were the sort of the birth of the two-party system in the United States and the incredible partisan rancor. And in 1798, Robert Treat Paine Jr. wrote a set of lyrics called Adams and Liberty, supporting John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts against the French and against the Democrats. That's really the song that explodes politically. And that's where people learn the melody. It's not from the Anacreontic song,
Right.
which was a pretty
Right.
weird, esoteric thing that only got performed
Right.
in these shows. But this is where it entered the political mainstream, the popular mainstream in the United States. And there are literally a dozen parodies of Adams and Liberty that explode in the late 1790s. And there are 6 different sheet music editions that are published in magazines nationally. So it's through Adams and Liberty that everybody gets to know the tune, probably including Francis Scott Key, right? Whose uncle is a Federalist, who's in Washington, D.C. as a young lawyer. And the reason we know for 100% certain that Francis Scott Key knew the melody before he was in Baltimore Harbor in 1814 is that in 1805, he writes his first song. It's a song called When the Warrior Returns, and it goes, when the warrior returns from the battle afar. So it's written to exactly the same melody, and it's 9 years before the Star-Spangled Banner.
One tune, Frank.
One pretty much, well, in my cataloging of these 450 lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner, 135 of them predate Francis Scott Key's The Star-Spangled Banner. So part of the art of democracy.
That's what I was about to ask you. Seriously, so this is a new discovery. 135 of different sheets or different texts on this tune before we even get to "Oh Say Can You See."
Right. There's "Oh Sons of Columbia, who bravely have fought for their rights." So it goes on and on and on. And so what it is there's a political debate, a conversation happening through these newspaper ballots. People are,
Right.
Sort of literate people who are involved with politics and sort of obsessed, like many of us are now today, are writing lyrics in order and publishing them in newspapers. And then they're trying to get other people to come over to their side. So there's this musical argument to bring emotion into politics. And that's both powerful and dangerous, but very much an active sort of political discourse that Francis Scott Key just jumps into. It's not something he starts. Today, we only remember a handful of these lyrics, right? But a lot of patriotic song from this era started in this way. Yankee Doodle is written to a previous tune. My Country 'Tis the Sea is written to God Bless, the King. America the Beautiful. Hail Columbia is to the President's March. Star-Spangled Banner is to Anacreon. So this was the way people wrote songs that commented on day-to-day life. And so what I love about this, and why it connects to that kid who was in youth orchestra who has said music is about my life, is that patriotic song becomes a kind of verb, right? It's not an icon. It's not this noun, this sacred thing to be, worshipped. It's actually a process that you're supposed to get involved with the conversation. You're supposed to sing these songs. You're supposed to write new lyrics. And that's what Francis Scott Key was doing. And he was using the obvious tune that everybody else was using to talk about the war.
Right. When do we hear word and tune melded the first time?
With this
can you see?
So it's a song.
When do we hear the poem and the music? When is it recognized that it belongs together? Because the poem was published separately first.
Right.
The Battle of Fort McHenry, right? So it came into general conscious order. Did people immediately start singing it?
Well, this is an interesting story, because in the 1870s, when people have started to distance themselves from this sort of broadside tradition of publishing these lyrics to well-known tunes, people started to misremember what happened. And so there's this veteran from the War of 1812 who's interviewed in Harper's magazine, who says, oh yeah, I know who did that. There was this guy, he was an actor named Charles Durang, and he's the guy who noticed that you could sing Francis Scott Key's text to this melody. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the very first printing, which was on just a plain sheet of paper of the lyrics, and it's a set of lyrics that Francis Scott Key gave to either one of two people who took it to the printer. And that very one, it has a little intro at the top, and then it says tune Anacreon in Heaven. So from the very start, it said on the very first printing, here are the words, but here's the melody you use, right? And if you look at the song,
so we can legitimately say that Francis Scott Key, in the bow of that British ship, was writing a song.
Absolutely. And I think what he did is he remembered the lyric he had written to The Warrior Returns in 1805 for other naval heroes, Stephen Decatur and Charles Stewart. And he just literally copied that form over. Right. And in The Warrior Returns, it's actually the first time he ever uses, and anyone in history ever uses, the phrase Star-Spangled to refer to the American flag. So in Warrior Returns, it says the star-spangled flag of our nation. In the Star-Spangled Banner, that becomes the main image that drives the whole lyric. But if you tried to take the Star-Spangled Banner and sing it to another tune, it wouldn't work. Because what's characteristic about the Star-Spangled Banner, the anacreontic melody that makes it powerful for song, is the arch form that it has, right? It's those high notes. Right. And the high notes give you that moment of drama and tension. So in the poem, the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, that's the crux of the matter, right? In a battle, it's the things that are going to kill you, right? It's the bombs, it's those scary rockets. Those get the high note. It's not an accident that those words are there. Key knew that he was putting that at the tension point of the whole lyric. Right. And then the last two lines, that question, which becomes emphatic by the fourth verse, is that flag, the land of the free and the home of the brave, is it still there? That's the line that was repeated by the community back and forth in that original ritual that comes from the Anacreontic Club, right? Where you echoed back the last two lines. So it's sort of built for political discourse, because you literally sing your idea, and then as part of the cultural ritual, everybody sings it back at you. So what better way to develop agreement as a political song than to have you sing and then the audience echoes it back? I'm sure as a performer that's happened to you, like people's that relationship with the crowd. But that ritual is built into the music of Anacreon. But it was always a song. It was never a poem.
It was exactly. I think that's or legend set to music kind of thing. I think that's an important point. I think some people might be confused with that. This is wonderful stuff. Isn't this? It's fascinating, ladies and gentlemen. It's fantastic. And I know we're broadcasting auch live on Hamsung Foundation Facebook. page, which have a lot of wonderful song lovers and so forth. So, this is, everybody's mouth is watering. This is fantastic. Mark, you're fantastic. Tell me something. Francis Scott Key is a political prisoner in the bow of a ship, a British ship, right? When he's writing this. And he's looking out.
This is another one of the little slight myths around it. So it's not really a drinking song. It's never a poem. And actually, Francis Scott Key is on an American ship during the battle. So he goes out, he meets with the British High Command. They have imprisoned a friend of his named Beans, who's a doctor from Marlborough, who was sort of picked up. That's another long story. But in any event, sort of a final insult to the Americans, but also supposedly for tactical reasons. When they get to Baltimore and they're about to have the battle, they say, well, you can't go because you'll give away important information. You've heard the officers talking. You've been having dinner with us for the last 4 or 5 nights. You've been our guests. You're going to have to stay. And so they demand to be put back on their American ship, which had been towed along the whole time behind the frigate of the admiral. And they wait out the battle anchored like 6 miles away. So if you've seen that famous picture where Key is like on the gunwale and there's a big cannon right next to him and British ships or troops guarding him, like he's not actually on a British ship. He's on an American truce ship, which is intentionally not armored because you don't go up to parlay with the enemy with giant guns pointed at them. They don't take that well. So he was on an American ship. We don't know the name of that ship, but it was basically he rented a boat in Baltimore and it took it out into the harbor.
My question was going to be whether you thought that at any part in this time that Francis Scott Key was fearful of his life, but I think you've already answered that. He was not in physical battle danger.
I don't think so. No, I mean, I think he was annoyed to be stuck there because he wanted to get home. One of the other amazing things about it is that they, the way we tell the story tends to heighten the drama and the excitement of it. So he's under duress. He's a prisoner in the British ship. He can't see what's going on. Actually, he's on his own boat. He has a spyglass. He can see the flag from far away. But he is held under guard. So he is a prisoner in that sense of the British. But another thing is that it's represented as a kind of flash of inspiration. Like he sees the flag that next morning and bam, the words just sort of explode in his mind. And he whips out the only thing he has, which is a back of a letter, and he writes out the lyric. In truth, he was aboard an American truce vessel, which had an ample supply of paper because they had to write official correspondence to the president, among other things. And Skinner, who's the guy with him, is writing letters to people all the time, right? So he had plenty of paper if he'd wanted to. I think he actually just composed in his mind. He didn't really use paper, maybe just a few notes to jog his memory. But the other thing that's interesting is that, I mean, this is the British fleet is the most powerful military weapon in the world at this point. They have these bomb ships that can kick anybody's butt, basically. They have a longer range than the guns coming out of Baltimore. They just park themselves 2 miles from the fort and they can just fire away for 25 hours and the fort can't really fire back. And basically what happens is that they're also attacking by land at the same time. General Robert Ross gets killed by a sniper and the British sort of figure out, well, we can beat these guys, but it's going to be really costly. Like a lot of our guys are going to die. It's probably not worth the trouble. There's a disagreement between the leader of the army and a leader of the Navy, who are both there. And basically the Navy guy, Cochrane, goes, if you want to attack Baltimore, go right ahead. I can't do anything. My ships can't. I'm not making any progress against the fort, but it's up to you. But if it goes wrong, it's your fault. And so the British Army guy says, basically, I'm not taking the heat for this one. Let's go home. So they are literally at the doors of Baltimore and they pull back. But the whole next day, nobody really knows what's going on. And Key, of course, is aboard a boat and he's not getting any information. He can't check Twitter to see what happened. What's the latest tweet from the fort? So actually it's a very information poor environment, which is part of why he writes this abstract patriotic ballad, because he knows basically that Baltimore's been saved because the British are pulling back, but he doesn't know many details about what actually happens. But he spends 3 days on that ship. The British keep him trapped and under guard for 3 days. And basically they say, you can't leave until we're ready to leave. And we're not in any hurry because these Americans can't even fight us, right? They can't shoot this far. So we're just going to repair the boats and get everybody back on board and tend to our wounded and take care of everything. And then you can go. And so if you stick a poet on a boat for 3 days with nothing to do, he's going to write a poem, write a lyric. So it's not a flash of inspiration. It might be a flash of inspiration, but it's a very carefully worked out lyric. And it's the quality of the lyric, actually, I think, is part of why it's successful. It's, you know, the words match the tune, the stress, the triple beat of the rhythm, which is unusual. You know, it just falls properly. You don't accidentally write a lyric that fits this very strange tune in certain ways. So, but he had plenty of time.
When was the sacking of the capital? Was that before?
So that was a month before.
Right.
And in the Georgetown militia was Francis Scott Key. So Francis Scott Key had seen the British walk all over Washington, D.C. They had seen them burn the Capitol building, including the Library of Congress. So he was angry. That's the explanation for the second and third verses, which are so anti-British, is that he was appalled at the behavior of the British, who he had always idolized because his family was British. He was trained in British law. His uncle was a Federalist and a loyalist. You know, so he really had idolized the British, and it was really disillusioning to see basically, you know, British High Command said, we're going to get back at Baltimore, because Baltimore is where a lot of the sort of pirate ships of the Americas came out, right? So Baltimore was the third largest city in the United States at the time. They had a very sort of strong privateering fleet that captured a lot of British goods. And so they were going out for revenge. Like Washington, D.C. was sort of a lame capital, very small backwater place, had been created basically as a compromise, right? So between the North and the South, we're going to put a capital in the middle of the swamp. And it just had it didn't have a robust defense, whereas Baltimore was.
And ladies and gentlemen, we actually a real swamp. We're not being political.
Yes, exactly. There is a real swamp there, turns out.
And there's a legitimate philological reason why the words swamp and Washington, D.C. are very often in the same sentence. Never mind. Okay, so when does the tune catch on? I mean, how long have people been singing "Oh, say, can you see from" and meaning it as a patriotic recollection?
So, I mean, in a sense, immediately. I mean, it was popular. Key also helped along because he made 1,000 copies and had them give out to all the members of the fort who defended. So it sort of got immediately distributed. And it was picked up by the Analectic magazine and a few other things, you know, that basically say, this is a good one. We should keep this one. And
Fort McHenry was considered to be a significant battle success for the Americans.
Absolutely. I mean, because the British had literally walked through Washington, D.C. unchallenged. Yeah.
We beat the sons of bitches there, and this is our song for it.
They didn't think they had won the war, but they had thought that they turned the tide. And for Francis Scott Key, he literally thought God had changed sides. Like he thought God was on the British side, punishing America. So the last verse, you know, "Oh, thus be it ever, you know, when free men shall stand," and then the whole thing, you know, "In God is our trust," which gets modified as the little logo on our currency in the United States. That actually comes from the fourth verse of the Star-Spangled Banner. And he wanted basically the United States in that fourth verse to sort of fly straight and come together and stop being partisan and start being more pious. And he thought that was the way the country would be.
And we're talking about 200 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. We're not talking about now. We're not taking political sin. Isn't that nice?
That separation of church and state is right at this time. Yeah. Go ahead.
So then this tune picks up, people know it and so forth. And then this is where my revelation, my serendipity came, or not serendipity, my epiphany. When you were showing me some of these pretty dramatic texts, women's suffrage, certainly abolition texts, and other people are doing variations on the songs. They're doing arrangements of the tune and filling it out for orchestras and filling out for choirs, filling out for organ pieces. So it's starting to take on a life of its own, and people are using the tune as a real bully pulpit for contemporary social issues well before the Civil War, which is kind of startling. I mean, one of my favorite texts that I would sing and read in the concerts that I've been doing with the Song of America tour, Beyond Liberty, and I chose to read the text because it just took too long to sing it, and you can only sing B flat major so often until everybody kind of yawns and goes to sleep. But I was a little surprised at the women's suffrage text of 1844. That kind of took my breath back. The abolitionists' texts, And I warned people when I read the text and we had laid a context to the song in it that this is hard to hear. This is, the home of the free and the home of the free and the land of the free and the
slave.
home of the slave.
Yeah.
And I want to stay focused on the song. There are so many tributaries to this story, and I know that you're right now writing your book and finishing your book. You're on writing leave. You have sent me some amazing chapters that just have taken my breath away. In some of the miscellany of the time, but also the human context of the people involved in this evolving story and this rabid obscenity of American culture called slavery. And I don't know if you can touch on it. And if I say touch on it lightly, I don't mean anyone to take offense at that it's not an important subject. I think when you're even farther in your book or your book is done, what we want to do is one of those things we did in June. We want to get 4 or 5 scholars and try and wade in really how vexed, paradoxical, and obscene so much of our history is of venerated, achieving monumental souls like a Francis Scott Key, who in himself carries such a contradictory cultural attitude for our contemporary sign. I think this is the responsibility of our time. I think that that's the only way we can move forward. I think it's why Democracy in Black was one of my favorite books. We need to own this sin, and then we can move forward. It seems to me that we're getting closer to that. I hope that Black Lives Matter becomes and remains the momentum that it is, and finds a way to be as less violent as humanly possible. Violence is never an answer. And I don't mean to digress here so much or lecture, but violence is a natural instinct of human beings. Prosecuted violence, specifically war, is a political tool. And I think we would do well to remember that in these contentious times. I mean, it sickened my stomach. I am going to make a contemporary comment in commiseration. It breaks my heart as a mature American to see CNN or any other body reporting on the various businesses boarding up their windows because of the suspected violence. And this isn't just in big cities. This isn't just a Los Angeles, New York thing. You've got cities in North Dakota, and you've got or South Dakota and Montana and Ohio, boarding up because they're afraid there might be riots. Which, by the way, Mark, and I'm done lecturing. I've got a question or a thought that I think you could extrapolate on. It is interesting to me, and you mentioned it when we talk about the 13th Amendment, we talk about the 14th Amendment. These are abolishing slavery and voting rights. But if you actually go through so many seminal moments of our history where it required a vote, our holy democracy, the ones that we cherish many years later and say, oh, well, at least we got it together and did the 13th Amendment, it was ratified in some cases by 300 votes in a population of several thousand. It came to the Congress by 2 votes, it won. I mean, we talk about John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy won the presidency by a slimmer margin than any previous president had ever won. Did you know that?
I didn't know that. No.
And Nixon, Kennedy, the great Kennedy, the Camelot, the whole thing, right? A slimmer margin. And it was actually, I mean, he did win, and Nixon was not happy, and it took as long as somebody had ever taken to that time, but it was politics as you and I grew up. It was the agreement to disagree. All right, for whatever reason, chicanery, popular, whatever, always at that day where we call it election, this is what fell down and this is what happened. And Nixon extraordinarily elegantly capitulated. And as we say, the rest is history. But when you watch the movie Lincoln and you see how hard he fought for the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment barely passed. And then it went around to the various states and they barely passed. And how many things have not passed that went the other way that we can't talk about anymore? And there's a certain story in all of that with your protagonists in this story, not just Francis Scott Key, but his brother-in-law, and I mean, probably too wide of a story to get into tonight. We'll do what I promise, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do a Hampson Foundation thing here when Mark is ready, and we'll do a big evening, and we'll invite some of the more extraordinary, well, maybe the same protagonists we had in June, certainly with Bill Banfield and Louise and you and maybe we get another American historian on it, you know, and really, you know, it is incumbent upon all of us. This is not just a white-black issue. This is an American issue, and it's interesting, and why I'm rapping on this is that an iconic song of harmless patriotism, ha 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 ha, has such roots of connectivity to the essential issues that we're still dealing with today.
Yeah, no, I think
you want to wrap
the Civil
that?
Well, the Civil War is really the time that makes the Star-Spangled Banner into the anthem. Not legally, that doesn't happen until 1931, but it's the thing that really makes the song sacred in a way, because it's, you know, in Francis Scott Key's day at the Battle of Baltimore, the number of states and the number of stars on the flag didn't matter. Like, they didn't match, and it wasn't that important. You know, after that time, the flag really becomes a more important symbol, and there's a symbiosis between the stars and the stripes and Key's song. So in the, you know, the Civil War, when the South Carolina secedes and the other 11 and then 13 states, it's none of those stars come off. So that flag becomes the symbol of the Union, the symbol of staying together, the symbol of that commitment. And blood is shed on both sides of America, the political divide at that time, to preserve that Union. And so it really changes the song and changes the flag. And that's, I think, what then tips the scales and makes it into this anthem. What makes the Star-Spangled Banner the national anthem is not the bill that was signed by Congress in 31 that Hoover signed. It's really what people do with the song. Right. And so in that sense, if we wanted to change it, if we want a different song, we just have to start using another one. Like, I don't think it's a matter of waiting for Congress to act. It's really a social contract. And what patriotism should do when it's healthy is that it creates that sense of a community that allows for the peaceful transition of power, that allows people to say that the whole is greater than these two political parties. But it's been a cycle in American politics that we get to these moments of crisis. This is not the worst. The Civil War is way worse than today. But I think we're all worried about what's going to happen. But something like the Star-Spangled Banner is the thing that should be the glue that holds people together. It's that commitment to the whole. Of course, any kind of art or political stuff can be used as propaganda, can be used to silence, can be used as violence to drown out the opposition, or a kind of social pressure to coerce people into falling in line. And there's two sides of the coin of patriotism, one of which can be sort of help us imagine a community together, but there's also a part that can tear it apart.
I love this quote that you have. He has been described as the forgotten man who wrote the words that nobody can remember to the tune nobody can sing, and hence became famous as the author of the national anthem. He was Francis Scott Key. Who was Elmo Scott Watson in 1935?
I think he was a writer for Life magazine. I can't remember exactly where that's from, but it's one of those quotes that gets passed around. Yeah. But it's the story of the anthem really is the story of America, which is why it's taken me so long to write, but why it's so fascinating. And I totally agree with you. It's that embrace of the complications and the contradictions, the evils of slavery, understanding how that happened, and how core that sort of immoral compromise was from the very moment the Constitution was signed and ratified. That was an issue that people were struggling with. And one of the things, if you trace all of these lyrics, is that you see that the issue of race and equality and what does freedom mean, what does liberty mean, these are constantly being debated, and they can change. And I think if there's anything that having song be political tells us, is that we have to continue singing, we have to continue to write works and perform them that create the kind of life we want to have.
When did the lyrics stop? When did people stop writing another set of text to this? Or what is the latest lyric in history to this tune?
So I haven't searched the internet today on this topic, but I mean, there are
Ah,
songs about Trump written to the Star-Spangled Banner. So
seriously.
seriously, it has not stopped. It is still continuing. There
When
was
your
a
book comes out, is there going to be a volume two, and the volume two is just going to be a collection of all these texts?
one of my early
Is it a
drafts with my
two-volume?
editor. I had like all these texts quoted, and he said, "You can't do that." So we're going to put up a website and have all the text on the website, so you can search it. And I think it'll be fascinating to see what people figure out that I can't figure out. I mean, part of the challenge of this project is it's too big for any one person to really understand, because it's the whole history of a
Who's going to
mass.
make the website? Is it going to be University of Michigan website or a private website or the publisher's website? May I throw my hat in the ring? I would love Hampson
We
Foundation to.
could partner on that for sure. Yeah, I'm happy to
Absolutely.
talk to you. I know you know people.
Well, look, I think, ladies and gentlemen, we've talked for an hour. It's a fascinating story, but since it's election night, you sent a nice list of music. Should we listen? What do you think we should listen to? I don't think we're up for Hendrix. Should we listen to Dudley Buck? I don't know Jake Hackey. I know the opera, but I haven't heard this, the Star-Spangled Banner. Is that a nice piece? Is it interesting?
It's a humorous one. It's a take on an opera singer performing the Star-Spangled Banner at the Super Bowl. So it's
And forgetting the words?
I don't think she forgets it. She elaborates quite a bit.
Right.
I think that's the personification of the anthem. The Dudley Buck variations are sort of a virtuoso organ variations. They're really part of like how Americans got to know the classical music in the post-Civil War era, through church organs and through variation sets.
We're not going to listen to all of it anyway, so let's have it. Now you're looking at my browser. You're looking at my screen. You're seeing IDAGIO, which you can just a quick explanation. IDAGIO, it can be on your browser. This is in my web browser, but it's also got an on-computer app for PC and for Mac. It's also Android as well as iOS, meaning Mac, iPad, iPhone. One of my favorite things about IDAGIO, other than its literally 20,000 classical composers, which I didn't even know there were 20,000 classical composers. The database is huge and growing every day, but you can also make playlists. And the minute you make a playlist, I made an SSP playlist. I only have 2 tracks on it. But if you find anything you like and you go over here, here this chevron will tell you more interesting information about what you're about to listen to. This ellipse over here, you can save it to a collection, or you can make a playlist. The minute I've done this, if I were to open up IDAGIO on my telephone, that playlist would be with me. So you get the idea. You can make a playlist because you're going to drive for an hour to work, or you can play a list because you're going to walk in the park. You can do whatever you want. You can collect all sorts of music. It's quite a fun streaming platform, and I love to show people how it works. So we're going to go into my playlist, and we have Dudley Buck. Now, what I think is going to happen, because I've opened this chevron, is that when we play it, on the right-hand side should be any other recordings of this by somebody else in the catalog. Could be there are none other, but we might see that. Let's listen to a little bit of Dudley Buck, concert variations on the Star-Spangled Banner, June 18, recorded in Los Angeles at the Walt Disney Concert Hall, that has one of the more spectacular new organs at its pleasure, played by Jung Ah Lee. Now, you have to admit that is a better sound than most of the organs playing the same thing at any ballpark that you hear this at. I'm going to drop the needle a little bit later because, as you can tell, as concert variations, I think it gets quite big and huge and crazy, doesn't it? Let's just drop the needle here. I'll just scrub down here. Let's just another couple of seconds and see if we can have some fun. All right, that's the idea. You can actually, on IDAGIO, it's quite fun. You can look up the Star-Spangled Banner. I'm so curious. Let's just have a quick listen at Jake Hagee.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Super Bowl welcomes America's fast-rising opera star, Tatiana Bax.
The Star-Spangled Banner, national anthem, with variations.
Okay, you get the idea. This sounds like quite a scene.
So Thomas, do you have any stories about singing the Star-Spangled Banner? Have you, had the pleasure?
I think that I sang it so often at the Sprague Coolidge Auditorium that I've sung my allotted. I'm going to confess to something. I've never been invited to sing the Star-Spangled Banner for anything.
Really?
Ever. My closest claim to fame was I was doing the Merry Widow in Chicago when the terrible terrorist act in France happened.
Oh.
And they were in solidarity wanting to have someone sing the Marseillaise. So they called up and they called me up and said, do you know the Marseillaise? Of course I know the Marseillaise, but I didn't know it by memory. So I said, sure, I'll come down and sing it. So I came downstairs and they were going to run the board. So I did and it was by a track. They were going to play a track. And so I had my little iPad mini, and I was just going to check the words every so often. I looked at it in the afternoon. Literally, all of this happened within like 2.5 hours. It wasn't like I was lazy or stupid, more than usual. And so I started to sing, and they say, "What's he got in his hand?" And so this girl, "Excuse me, sir, what's in your hand?" I said, "Well, what do you think? It's an iPad." Why do you? It's an iPad. Why do you have an iPad? Because I don't know the words. Yeah, we're going to play the words out here. Yes, but you don't play the music. That he wants to keep the mic. He can't keep the mic. What he can't do without the. Then he's fired. I was fired from the Bulls game. And as all these huge guys were coming into practice, the word got around that I got fired, and about 3 or 4 performances later, the Merry Widow, a couple of these huge, long, great guys who actually liked the Chicago lyric came by to say thanks for trying. Not only have I not been invited to sing the Star-Spangled Banner for anything, but I've been fired for trying to sing the Marseillaise. So. So much. So
another thing in our singing career that we have in common, Thomas.
I have exactly. Yeah, I did on the last tour. It was the Star-Spangled Banner, and your work was extraordinarily prominent in that through the evening of the Song of America journey of the history of our culture, I would let it show up in text and sound and texture. And one of the more moving moments was that moment where Walter Damrosch, so the first Lenny Bernstein of the New York Philharmonic, in World War I was talking to 3,000 young people in a young people's concerts, and gave a very beautiful lecture about the Star-Spangled Banner is to our eyes and to our heart, in the way that the song is through our ears to our heart to engage. And very poetic text, whether you're born here or somewhere else, this is the sound of what binds us, exactly what you were saying, as a community. And it is our duty to protect, fight, and love that community through all. And I think that goes back to, I didn't touch on any of the aspects of Francis Scott Key's life, and specifically not hiding the fact that he's a slave owner, and that this is a big issue and a huge issue that we need to address in America in the social historical context and the obscenity of it. But what you said earlier about this community and this notion of union, this overriding belief that no matter how bad, how awful, how wrong, that the union must be preserved, that the union must remain intact. And I mean, we hear this in the beautiful words of Abraham Lincoln as well. And without question, if you put the beauty of Abraham Lincoln and you have this national anthem and you have the completely disillusioning, obscene reality of how these people lived, fought for blacks looking for emancipation while owning several people. It's just something we can't get our head around. And then you read Frederick Douglass's lecture, I forget what year it was, on what the 4th of July means to African Americans. And then just take all of that 100 years later into the civil rights movements that is not just the 1960s. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if we don't all hold hands and collectively bury this sin, own up to it, and then that's the only way we can, and move forward and recognize the hundreds of myriads of lives in our history that have tried to do that, and we still haven't achieved it. You can't say that we've achieved it. We wouldn't be in the state that we are now if we'd achieved it. And this whole idea of systemic racism, if we don't have systemic racism, then why is legislation for voting rights necessary?
Right.
Come on. And so what does that have to the Star-Spangled Banner? Well, everything, because the Star-Spangled Banner in its flawed personal birth is a tune that galvanizes. Why is it important for sports people to kneel during that tune? It's just a harmless tune, right? B flat major is B flat major. But it becomes something else. And I think that's also something that we feel passionate about, meaning you and me and our team in this project, Art of Democracy. That it is that there's so much in our art in America that is about the manifestation of democracy, but then in fact it is a democratic effort to create a song that the evidence of context and emotion as an American in a poem and song is as much an evidence of democracy as any other part of democracy. And that, it's amazing. And you've sent me, I love to riff on that. I love to speak with you anyway, but what you've given us this evening is just such a rich landscape of so many associations, and we're not even done, ladies and gentlemen. I promise you, we need to go to the next level. We need to go into Francis's life. We need to go into the historical context. We need to get everything from Thomas Jefferson to Ben Franklin to the Dred Scott decision, and right on up through Plessy Ferguson and the Brown versus the Board of Education and George Floyd. We're not done yet. And it's all somewhere in a poem and a lot in a music. And that's why we do what we do, you and I.
I couldn't agree with you more.
You're great. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's been fun.
Sorry.
It's just, can't think of anybody I'd rather spend today with than talking about this. And it's so helpful for me just to engage with you in these conversations. And this, you bring so much to understanding and the experience of music, but of American history, that I so greatly value, and it helps me and push my own work to the next level. So thank you very much.
So when's the book coming out?
hopefully next year. So it's due at the end of November. So I'm burning the midnight oil. You got me out of my hall for
Oh my
1
God.
hour today.
No, that's why Christy, my managing director of the foundation, said, I've written him 3 emails. What's wrong with him? And I said, what do you think he's wrong with? He's under a rock. He's writing 24/7. Anyway, we'll go back to your rock. You're great, Mark. It's great visiting with you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a wonderful evening. It's election day. If you haven't voted, please vote. It's not a privilege. It's a right. It's a responsibility. I hope you've already voted. I can't believe 103 million people voted early. On the other hand, I can't believe we still have a voting system that requires people to stand 10 hours out in the rain sometimes to vote. You know, you would think if we took our democracy seriously, we would make a voting system that was ecumenical and fair and accessible in every possible stretch of the imagination. But clearly there's something else going on. But that's another show. Anyway, vote. Have a great evening. We will see you next week. Mark, I will see you soon.
All right.
Oh, I love your
Take care.
book. Yes, The
Thanks,
Artist.
everyone.
What a wonderful book. Oh, just look at, take a picture of his bookshelf, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great place.